Methane emissions and fines under the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, presented by Professor Mohamed Badissy at the Dickinson Law at Pennsylvania State University. And Professor, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to Dana, both of you for hosting me today. I will say that I'm excited to have this conversation because this is one of those topics that is literally sort of ripped from the headlines. This is a now conversation. I'll preface this all by saying that, don't be disappointed if the answer to a lot of questions you have is we don't know yet, because that's just how new this topic is. But in general, and I'm going to share my slides here now, the issue of methane emissions itself has been a concern or a focus of regulators for quite a while. The innovation we have here is that for the first time, at least at the federal level, we have an actual number, a dollar amount that is going to be charged on those emissions. In other words, here's your first slide. And just so you know, the way I like to approach presentations, I'm going to put a bunch of text up on the screen. I'm not going to read it to you because that's a waste of your time. And also, I'm going to use each one of these as a starting off point for a discussion. So consider the text up here, and even have some of the legislative language in here later on as a reference for you. You'll have these slides afterwards. You could use them for review. But the sort of top level headline here is, for a good long time, there has been a debate at the political level. There's been sort of research from academics like myself, and I'd say concern for regulators like many of the folks we have in the audience about how we're going to tackle the issue of limiting methane emissions, and then more importantly, incentivizing, and frankly, let's use the right word, penalizing those emissions. Sorry. Ooh, apologies. So just by way of background, so I have been a lawyer for too long, but when I started my career, almost 20 years ago, in private practice, I worked for a large law firm doing oil and gas projects, mostly internationally, but some here in the US. There's always been this sort of specter, of at some point, everybody knew that there would be policy and regulation to address methane emissions, and probably tied to that, some sort of economic penalty. The trouble is that, over the years, we've had a lot of attempts to address the issue, but never really anything as concrete as we now have in the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. The EPA for years has been researching sort of a standard operating procedures, or a sort of a standardized approach to limiting methane emissions, everywhere from improved sort of well completion rules to putting in place stricter guidelines under the Clean Air Act, defining what permitted emissions are, and then sort of describing what the thresholds must be. But despite sort of the knowledge that has been generated, there was never consensus. And I think maybe the even more appropriate term is there was never the political will to actually put a tax, to put a number on those emissions charges. For those of you who are familiar with the Clean Air Act and sort of emissions generally, it's not that we lacked, let's say, enforcement power. The EPA has always had, under the Clean Air Act, the ability to designate and identify where there have been excess emissions, and then on a case-by-case basis, calculate sort of the actual impact of those excess emissions and maybe fine that particular entity. But it's very different for the sort of norm before today being case by case, sort of being limited to particular emitters in particular contexts. That's very different than a tax. That's very different than a penalty. What we have here in the Inflation Reduction Act is a blanket framework. That is to say, one rule that applies to an entire set of actors. And we'll get into the list of folks who are impacted later on. And tied to that, rather than we'll figure out what the fine is later on methodology, a number. Again, I'm going to call it a penalty. Some people call it a tax. This is, I think, for those of you who like to think sort of bigger picture, maybe the first step or the first attempt at something like a carbon tax. In many ways, I think the way that this rule making plays out at the EPA level and the enforcement plays out, frankly, probably through a lot of your institutions at the regulatory and local level, the sort of lessons learned from this will probably inform what, if any, larger carbon tax regime we come up with later on. And the other thing to point out here is we are right at the beginning of this conversation. We have in the Inflation Reduction Act the creation of authority. The EPA now has the authority to use the emissions tracking and the emissions reporting regime that's already in place to track those emissions, set a threshold level, and then charge a penalty against any emissions that exceed that threshold. Now, that's a power that they have. It's not entirely clear how they're going to exercise it just yet. I'll mention towards the end of this presentation how the EPA just opened up the comment period on this methane regime, which, by the way, there's only one comment so far. So you want to get in early and capture the EPA's attention. It's a great time to log on to the resources. Is it regulations.gov website? I think you can submit comments. I'll stick that link in the chat later on. But realize that what I'm describing for you here are the outlines of what could happen. In many ways, what will actually happen will be informed by that rulemaking process of the EPA, and hopefully by the feedback of folks like yourself who are actual stakeholders in this entire situation. So to basics, now we have a methane emissions charge, a methane emissions tax, a methane emissions penalty. What is sort of the contour of that particular system? So the most basic definition we have here is that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm going to call it the IRA for short, defines methane as a greenhouse gas, which has already been the assumption, but now it's more clear, both under the IRA and its amendments to the Clean Air Act. It also defines that as a greenhouse gas in terms of its climate potential. For those of you, I'm going to obviously not pretend to be an engineer, but for those of you who understand the actual physics and the sort of the climate science better, we all know that methane has a higher sort of concentration impact or a sort of a multiplier effect. I think it's somewhere in the order of between 80 and sometimes 200 times more potent greenhouse gas than, say, carbon monoxide or sort of carbon dioxide. The IRA takes the step of defining methane as a category of a greenhouse gas and defining its impact because it's trying to justify something. Basically, the language that you find in this legislation is identifying methane as a dangerous, or in other words, costly pollutant, and setting up the justification for pricing or basically assessing the value of that negative impact. Now, this is important. It's important to even understand the definitions and sort of the scope of the new methane emissions charge, because I guarantee you that other folks with law degrees like myself will be litigating this in courts. And one of the primary challenges will probably be whether the EPA even has the authority to establish this type of tax or penalty regime. We'll assume for now that this is going to hold up in court, but realize one of sort of the fundamental questions here is this even within the scope of what the EPA can do? So, oh, and by the way, I'm seeing some great questions pop up in the Q&A. I strongly encourage you to put questions in the Q&A. I like to sort of integrate questions as we go along. We'll have a question and answer period at the end, but please do not hesitate to put either observations or comments or questions in the chat as we go along. Now, the point that's made in the Q&A, and it's important to emphasize here, for now, this is an entirely federal program. The way the methane emissions charge regime is structured under the Inflation Reduction Act has the EPA as the observer, as the tracking agent. In other words, they are collecting emissions data through the existing greenhouse emissions reporting program, the GHGRP, for those of you who are familiar with it. In other words, that's not new. EPA has already been receiving emissions data from those who are required to report under that regime for quite a while. It is the EPA that assesses those emissions, either through if they need to do an audit or if they accept them as submitted. And it is the EPA that calculates what, if any, methane charge will be applied. The expectation is, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, is that while this is a federal authority and while this is entirely sort of housed within the EPA, there's very little reason to think that it won't follow the same strategy that we've seen in the past, where eventually the EPA will reach out to and try and coordinate with state agencies as the actual frontline enforcement bodies, or even possibly reporting and sort of verification bodies. In other words, while this is a federal program now, functionally speaking, it's highly unlikely that the EPA is going to want to maintain the burden entirely on itself, on its resources, and also politically speaking, keep it entirely at the federal level. You should expect to see outreach and coordination at some point with state agencies. And I'll note later on, there's actually some liabilities in here for state regulators as well. So the definition of methane, the sort of classification of methane, and the reporting of methane under the GHGRP, that's a reinforcement. That's not really new. What's new is the charge itself. You have there in your last bullet point. It's a 3-year program right now, starting in 2024, going through 24, 25, 25, 26, and 26, 27 as the reporting periods. And the first year, that is next year, of the program is going to assess a $900 per metric ton penalty on any methane emissions above the threshold. That will then rise to $1,500 in the second and third year of the program. Now, right, at sort of first impression, that's a considerable charge. That is a sort of, I would say, economically significant and almost market impacting fee, and intentionally so. This is meant to be an aggressive penalty regime to incentivize compliance and reform of operations at the field level, at facilities and others, to try and limit methane charges. So I think in the same way that I'm describing this as the beginnings of a program, what you see here is a very robust authority granted to the EPA, both in its monitoring and its tracking and its verification of the data, but also a very sort of robust penalty that it's allowed to assess. People like to talk about this as a carrots and sticks type initiative. There are other carrots in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's quite a few, I think something on the order of $180 billion set aside, both to subsidize the costs of either installing or improving methane capture systems at the field level. There are training funds available. It's not clear yet, but again, the comment period is open. There's possibly funds available to increase the capacity of state agencies to act as monitoring and enforcement bodies. So it's not entirely stick here, but I think, and again, I welcome comments in the chat, this is a bigger stick than we've seen before, that's for sure. And it's a bigger sort of threat that the EPA is able to put forward than they've had in the past under their sort of general authority. So if we understand the scope, we understand methane is sort of the target now, we have this sort of this pricing of those methane emissions, where the real work gets done. And I think where the most important role that you all can play as stakeholders in this process is in figuring out how the monitoring, assessment, and sort of enforcement process is actually going to play out. We have some guidance from the legislation that I'm going to share with you here, but a lot of the real work to be done is to figure out all the little details of how this is actually going to be implemented. Now, let's start with the targets, that is to say, the reporting obligation itself. What you have in front of you here is a basic summary. By the way, this is taken from the congressional report, the Congressional Research Service, so I'm happy to share those background documents as well. But at a top level, let's all understand that not every single polluter, not every single methane's emission source is within the scope of this new policy and of this new program. Because this methane emissions charge relies on that existing greenhouse reporting program, and because the greenhouse reporting program only requires reporting from those facilities and other sort of sources that emit more than 25,000 metric tons per year, right away, we actually have a smaller group to worry about of actors than you would think. You see that the largest group are production facilities, which makes sense, gathering, boosting, and sort of local services. Then quite a few compression facilities, because of their scale, come under this. But if you look past that, processing is another space, but not a lot in terms of the offshore or in terms of other sort of related gas facilities, because their scale is small enough or their emissions profile is small enough that they don't trigger the reporting requirement under that greenhouse reporting program. So right now, there's an estimate that roughly 2,000 plus actors, that is to say, licensed and permitted operating entities, will be subject to the possibility of being penalized under this program. At the same time, in classic Laura Lee fashion, this is a right now definition. There is nothing in the Inflation Reduction Act itself, or the Clean Air Act, or the Greenhouse sort of reporting program that stops the EPA from expanding or lowering that threshold. In other words, one of the reasons we have a pretty high threshold right now is because of the sort of logistical complexity in tracking and verifying methane emissions. As for those of you, again, who have more technical background than myself, you can understand just how complicated that can be. And most people would agree that the EPA sort of intentionally simplified the program to focus on the top emitters because that made their job easier. But over time, perhaps as monitoring technologies become more sophisticated, or the capacity to engage in monitoring, for example, through state agencies becomes more widespread, it's entirely possible to think and to anticipate that the threshold will be lowered and more operating entities will come within the scope of both the greenhouse reporting program and by extension of the methane charge itself. That being said, there's also the separate reality that certain states have already begun discussing the possibility of going beyond the EPA requirements, of having their own state level programs that mirror this new methane emissions charge, that have stricter requirements and actually have a larger net, may capture more operating entities than you see on this list. But for now, this is the general sort of target list or list of qualifying entities that are going to be subject to this new emissions charge. It's also worth pointing out that there are some exceptions in terms of reporting agencies. That's a whole separate presentation. We can talk about greenhouse reporting another time, but those exceptions will remain in place even though the threshold may move. So there will always be certain actors that are going to be outside the scope of this. But if that threshold number changes, this number, this sort of list of qualifying entities will certainly increase over time. So we understand the emissions charge, we understand sort of the definition of methane, the price has been put on it, and now sort of the actors who are involved. What is the actual obligation? What is the burden being placed upon these emitters? So again, the threshold is those with emissions above 25,000 metric tons. They're the ones who are on the list. That number is also the cutoff point for liability. In other words, if you exceed 25,000 metric tons of emissions, whatever amount you exceed that threshold by is the amount you can be penalized for under this new program. That's the general definition of sort of the point of liability under the new system. Within that general definition, we have some clarification and sort of some allowances for different types of facilities. You see there, this is the last three bullet points. Petroleum and natural gas production facilities, we're talking about the field level here. They're basically allowed a budget, an excess of that 25,000 that they will not be penalized for right away. It's 0.2% of their sort of sales volume. So there's an allowance there. You then have for non-production facilities and sort of natural gas processing, processing and other sort of related services, an even smaller allowance. You could say this makes sense because they traditionally don't have as much difficulty, or it's not as costly to manage methane emissions at that point. And then finally, natural gas transmission is given a rather sort of robust allowance as well, sort of almost on par with production of about a 0.11% or sort of a limited budget as well. What this is saying, and sort of legislative speak, is we have a strict threshold, 25,000 metric tons. Below that, companies will not face liability. And above that, the amount of excess emissions that will actually come within sort of the amount of penalty to be calculated will vary based upon these allowances for different types of facilities. And again, these are sort of floors that could be more strictly applied or even lowered by state agencies if they so choose. Let me pause here because we're going to get into sort of the details of the calculation of the charge itself, but if you take this all together, you start to understand that this is a pretty broad program with a wide number of sort of targets for observation and potential enforcement, and a rather strict definition of what the actual allowances will be at the end of the day. So now we understand, so let's call it the boundaries of the program. Where do we go from here? Well, I'm going to pull a professor move on you for a second. I like to think that the best way to read legislation is to find the rule, and we just talked about the rule, don't exceed 25,000, and then immediately go to the exemptions, because that rule really only means what it means to the extent that there's no exception to it. What you have in front of here is one of the most prominent exceptions to that charge, and I'm going to hide the ball on you for a little bit. Take a moment, 30 seconds, read this language, and ask yourself two questions. There's a privilege granted here, a benefit being granted to one actor. That's maybe the easier thing to find. But there's also a burden shifting, a new burden placed upon another actor in the marketplace. Ask yourself who's getting a benefit and who's carrying a burden here. There's almost always that trade-off in anything in this type of legislation. So I'm going to be quiet for 30 seconds, give you a chance to read. Okay, so now, because I pulled the professor move on you, I'm also going to give you the chance to show how smart you are. Feel free to drop in the chat, either tag sort of benefit, who you think gets the benefit, and burden, who carries the burden. And we'll see who's actually paying attention here. So who's getting a benefit here, and who is carrying a burden? Oh, okay, I'm seeing a few come through. Burden on state and local governments, burden on regulatory agencies, benefit on the permitter or the permittee, yeah. Okay. Now I'm going to give you all credit. I taught this very same lesson to my energy law class yesterday, and it took them about 15 minutes to figure this out. But I'm very, very glad to see that many of you immediately picked up on sort of the hidden burden in here, because it's not obvious to those who aren't practitioners like yourself and those who aren't on the front lines of regulation like yourself. If you read the language here, what it's saying is that facilities that may have excess emissions and that may be subject to a charge for those emissions can request an exemption from the EPA administrator, basically a pass, only if they can show that they were ready, willing, able to capture what previously was emitted methane, in other words, to limit the emissions, but operationally could not proceed with that methane capture because they didn't have the sort of evacuation capacity. They didn't have the gathering lines in place or the transmission infrastructure in place to actually export that excess gas from the site. That makes sense on its face. It makes sense that if an entity is invested and is prepared to sort of limit its emissions, but it's being constrained by something outside of its control, by a transmission capacity or a gathering line capacity issue, that perhaps we don't want to punish them because they're really not, they've done everything they can do. Well, what many of you picked up on here is this phrase, unreasonable delay. What that's telling us, I'm going to sort of move forward a slide now, is that essentially the new legislation sets up a dynamic where when a company wants to argue that it qualifies for this exemption and has to argue that directly to the EPA administrator, note that this is basically a purely discretionary determination by the administrator as to whether the exemption applies, they have to point a finger at someone. They have to shift the blame to somebody else. And as many of you caught on, they're shifting that blame to permitting agencies. For a company to successfully argue for an exemption, and I will, this is, if I were going to be a betting man and make my own predictions, which are worth nothing, but take them for what they are, this will probably be a widely used exemption, at least early on. Many companies are going to argue that they would limit their emissions, but for the lack of transmission capacity or the presence of sufficient gathering lines. And in doing so, they're gonna have to point a finger at many of you in the audience to say, oh, our local permitting authority is sitting on our gathering line permit, is sitting on sort of the pipeline permit, and that's delayed the process, and therefore, don't blame me, don't charge me a penalty. This is pretty rare in legislation and regulation and in government. In other words, there's a lot of back and forth and blame shifting in reality, but it's rarely part of the rule itself. And so what you have here is an actual sort of designated legal exemption that requires a showing of a failure by a permitting agency to issue permits on time. We could debate what unreasonable means in unreasonable delay, but right here you have perhaps one of the biggest takeaways from the sort of conversation we're going to have. A whole lot of scrutiny is coming your way. A whole lot of potential litigation is coming your way, to the extent that companies may have to prove to the EPA that it's not their fault, it's the regulator's fault that they can't actually limit their emissions. This right here is reason number one to get on the phone with your regional EPA office right now, or to submit comments on that comment period I mentioned that just opened up, or for, in general, close coordination with the EPA around this new rule set, because it would be absolutely disastrous, I think, if there was ever an open public determination that any permitting agency, anybody in the audience here, any sort of pipeline siting agency around the country, was unreasonably delaying its permits. It would have sort of political issues. It would be embarrassing in some places. It's going to sour the relationship between the EPA and the agencies that they're supposed to be working with for enforcement in the first place. I see this, if you want to see the worst sort of interpretation here, it's a way of shifting blame. If you want to take this in a slightly better light, it's an invitation for coordination. In other words, you want to have a very clear understanding ahead of time with the EPA as to what they're going to see as unreasonable or not. And so that everybody understands when this particular exemption will be triggered and avoids that at the end of the day. This is exactly the type of general language that's going to have to be put into sort of concrete implementation form, and exactly where coordination is extremely important. And let me just pause here. I mean, I have a bit of knowledge about the industry. I like to think that I don't know nothing, but I really can't think of other examples where, as a matter of law, a company is allowed to blame a state permitting agency to get out of a federal fine. Can anybody think of something similar? I always like to sort of pull the audience, because we have a collective wisdom here that goes beyond my own. Do you see this as unique as I do, or can you think of other similar situations? Feel free to sort of drop your thoughts either in the Q&A or in the chat. If I am right, this is new, it's a big deal, and it's something that has to be addressed, I think, in the back room, as opposed to playing out in the public space at the end of the day. And by the way, I saw a question in the chat about force majeure. Now, note here that this isn't a question of contract. This isn't a question of sort of breaking an agreement between anybody. So force majeure sort of comes into play in contract scenarios. There may be lots of ways to justify the delay on the part of state permitting agencies. And I think there are, but they're not defined here. Another reason for close coordination with the EPA is to understand what they will accept from permitting authorities as justification for delays. In other words, what is reasonable delay? Because it's not defined here, it's something that's going to end up being defined in practice, in coordination, in sort of practical understanding between all the parties. And I think there's some great comments in the chat. Pennsylvania does have sort of a permitting guarantee. Quite a few state agencies have sort of a commitment on the behalf of the permitting agency that if you go beyond a certain period, there may be a penalty paid or some sort of benefit. But what's the dynamic here, if you think about it, is that there's three parties: federal agency applying the penalty, sort of private entity that's subject to it, and this permitting authority at the state level that's sitting on a potential sort of necessary step. That dynamic I haven't seen before, and I think that's one of the sort of interesting questions that we have here. So that's, I'm going to say, headache number one and concern number one that I think we wanted to pass along as part of this sort of informational webinar. Let me put another piece of language in front of you here. I'll hide the ball for you again. I think this one's a little bit easier, but ask yourself, this is another exemption. And what impact do you think this is going to have on the marketplace? What is it going to mean in terms of, for you as regulators, what you see more of at the end of the day? Give me another just 20 seconds to think about it. Okay. So the question again is, feel free to sort of drop your thoughts in the chat. What sort of choice or incentive may this trigger on the part of private operators in the marketplace? And by extension, what impact may it have on you as regulators? Right? More abandonments. That's one of the comments I see. Ah. Okay. Increase in state director review, increase in sort of review and sort of approval of shutting in and abandonment of wells and certification of that. Okay, again, exactly right. I'm gonna have to tell my students again that you bested them 2 out of 2 so far. On its face, what's obvious here is that the carrot that's being dangled in front of companies is if you shut in a well. And by the way, it's both shut in and plug. That any excess emissions will not be charged. So, I mean, the way it's phrased, and I think this may change as the implementation guidelines are put out, but literally, if you plug in and shut in a well, so if you shut in and plug a well on December 31st of this year, you would be exempt from any excess emissions next year. And notice how sort of broad the language is. It says any shut in and plugging exempts you from methane emissions charges in the following year. So that's going to do 2 things. The obvious impact is going to be triggering more shut-ins and plugging of wells. The companies are going to run the numbers. They're going to do the math. They're going to figure out, well, you know, my production is so marginal that the system is so difficult in terms of improving operational efficiency or limiting emissions that the cost benefit analysis tells me I save money by, you know, shutting it down than I do by continuing to operate and paying a penalty. That's an oversimplification, but that's the basic sort of conversation that's going to happen at the boardroom level within a lot of companies. That on its face is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's been an attempt to incentivize the shutting in of inefficient or highly emitting wells for quite a while. But again, at the regulatory level, I'm going to go forward a slide here, this is going to have the natural effect of more people knocking on your door. More operators submitting requests for certification or verification of well shut-ins, early abandonment, and therefore perhaps early assessment of rehabilitation or sort of decommissioning requirements. It may accelerate the shutting down and the transition of operations to sort of a post-production profile faster than before. And again, that's the intent, but it's gonna it's just one other potential impact on your sort of person hours and your other resources as a regulator, because it's going to be a significant amount of additional activity. Again, there is no specific accommodation in the law for the resources that will be required at the state level to manage either the increase in what we talked about before of possibly litigation around delays, or here, the increase of permitting and verification around shut-ins. But there is a whole bunch of money set aside in the Inflation Reduction Act for the EPA to help, quote unquote, sort of help deal with the fallout and deal with the impact of this law. One more reason for close coordination, one more reasons for, I think, potentially co-financing or co-funding to anticipate the increased activity here and to anticipate the resources that are going to be necessary at the state level. Now, I think there are some very good points being raised in the chat, and I think, you know, questions put in the Q&A, but I think the chat discussion is helpful as well. Well, is there a guarantee that the shut-ins will actually produce the benefit of reducing emissions? I mean, there are mistakes, or there are badly conducted shut-off and sort of plugging operations that don't actually cut off emissions. There is nothing in here that requires the reporting entity, again, those entities that are required to report under the greenhouse reporting program, to show that the shut-in actually stopped the emissions. It's also not clear altogether of how they even show that a well was shut in the first place. It's an open question that is going to be have to be answered by you. In other words, companies are going to come knocking on your door saying, we need a way to show the EPA that our well was shut in so we can avoid this charge. It's not clear under the law how that's going to work. And it's going to be an answer that probably you will be forced to come up with and perhaps coordinate with the EPA with at the end of the day. There's a question of, will states be liable for fees for like orphan wells or wells that are perhaps under state administration? I want to make sure I understand the question there. There's nothing in the methane emissions regime or, I want to make sure I didn't lose my connection. Okay, good. So I just stuttered there for a second. There's nothing that defines or sort of brings into the scope orphan, marginal, or smaller wells. In fact, many of the provisions of this methane emissions charge and many of the provisions of the overall new regulations in the Inflation Reduction Act specifically exempt marginal wells and sort of low production facilities. They're sort of meant to be dealt with later on. So in some ways, that's a punt on those issues. But what we're seeing here clearly is that for those reporting agencies, they're going to have an incentive to shut in sooner, and they're going to need some participation, some support, some action on the part of regulators to qualify for that exemption at the end of the day. By the way, I also see a question in there about flaring. Just so you know, we'll get to that a little bit later on when we talk about sort of the exemptions for safety. So one more thing to keep in mind. An indirect impact. Now, for this one, I don't have specific language for or from the Inflation Reduction Act, but this is my interpretation and another question to raise, I think, in the minds of those of you who are actually doing the frontline work here. Naturally, the threat of the first $900, then later on $1,500 per metric ton above the threshold is going to incentivize companies to either shut down, like we just talked about, or retrofit, mitigate, or somehow limit emissions at the field level. That's going to have two sort of natural effects in the marketplace. One is they're going to end up borrowing a lot more money. If they're lucky to have the cash on hand, great, few companies do, but there will be sort of an extra burden on companies to invest in this capture and this mitigation technology, and that capital investment will often come with capital borrowing. That's a question in terms of possible increased bankruptcy or your concerns about sort of the financial health of operators in your market. But the second part is, and please, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my general experience, and I've had the pleasure of working with quite a few regulators around the country, is when you install or when you update a facility with additional systems for methane capture or methane emission mitigation, that often requires an update to your permits as well. That often requires an additional permitting activity. And as a result, even for the entities that decide to maintain operations and the ones that are doing exactly what the law wants them to do, which is invest in methane capture and limit emissions, it's still, again, going to have a knock-on effect of increasing activity and increasing the demands on state regulators, because the installation and the sort of upgrades at the field level, the processing level, transmission, and elsewhere will require some, I believe at a minimum in most instances, verification, if not even pre-authorization by your permitting agencies. And also, I had a discussion with a state tax auditor recently. It's also going to raise a lot of questions in terms of sort of tax liability, accelerated depreciation, et cetera, as to whether these upgrades are just normal capital investments, which are treated one way for tax purposes, or if they're required as a matter of regulation or law, which sometimes gets a different treatment under your state tax regime. So it's going to raise a lot of questions. In other words, apart from shutting down, apart from sort of those questions, even the entities that are complying with and reforming and limiting methane capture the way the law wants them to, that is still going to raise questions and challenges in terms of resources and process for many state regulators. This is the part where I try to stop and tell you some good news. I wish I had some. But I always have the pleasure, and I always like to point out that I have a tremendous respect, for the role that regulatory agencies play. I was in private practice, as I mentioned early on, and then I worked, for the government for 10 years, just understanding that that's where the real work gets done. And I think what you have in front of you here is a sober understanding that there is an important sort of policy objective here. There's an attempt to limit a potent greenhouse gas and to incentivize better behavior on the part of operators. You can debate that policy as much as you want, but that's the sort of the good news here. That's the attempt to make the world a better place part of this. The reality is, if you look at the last 3 points I just made, in that process, there is a significant burden shift, or at least burden increase, on state regulators. And so the simple thing to take away from there is that, agree with the policy or not, work is going to have to be done in terms of additional resources secured, coordination with the EPA, and likely coordination with your operators as well, to make sure that this doesn't become a flood of I don't know yet answers when the folks come knocking on the door, but hopefully get ahead of the issue and have a sort of consensus-based or coordinated way of dealing both with EPA implementation and eventually with operator requests sort of under this new regime. Now, a few more points to make here, and Dana, remind me, do we have an hour or an hour and a half? I really don't want to cut off folks for questions at the end.
1 hour.
Okay, so let me just do one more here and then we'll open it up. We do have 2 more things to note here. I'm not going to hide the ball on you on this one. I want to make it quick. There's 2 other interesting things that happen or that are part of the new regulation or the new legislation. One doesn't really have anything to do with state regulators and with methane emissions limits. It happens to be that there's an increased sort of royalty. I'll keep this language up here. Short and simple, on federal lands under federally permitted oil and gas operations, the federal government is now going to charge a royalty on all gas, including gas produced, now gas captured, and gas that could have been captured. There are limited exceptions. What you have here is, there is an exception. There's a question about this in the Q&A about for flaring or for venting. There's an exception for that. There's an exception for sort of aggregation or the sort of ring fencing, what they call communitization across different units. And also my favorite one at the end there, gas that is unavoidably lost. I don't actually know what that means, but it means something to somebody. And so that's part of the exception. The reason I think this is important for you at the state level, even though this is on federal lands under sort of federal permits, it lays a roadmap for where some of the gray area is. Possibly we'll see some states also adopt a same royalty reform where they're going to start charging a royalty not just on gas produced, but also on gas that could have been produced. If they do, they may have sort of an incentive to follow the same set of exemptions. It's I think a signaling on the part of the EPA and on the part of the new legislation on where the boundaries are. There are some safety exemptions. There are some understandings that not all gas could have been captured and therefore not all gas could have been charged, but the exemptions are still fairly strict. And then finally, one thing to point out, going forward, one of 2 things is going to happen. The EPA is going to finalize their rules for this new methane emissions charge. As I said, the comment period is open. I encourage you all to either directly comment or start having those private conversations with your field offices. So the methane emissions program is going to be a reality for the next 3 years. How it plays out, implementation TBD, but we know it's there. There is an alternative path, however. It is clearly stated within the Inflation Reduction Act that if the EPA finishes the promulgation, the putting out of a new set of rules on methane capture, guidance, and mitigation. And so if they put that sort of requirement on the books as an administrative requirement, and companies comply with those new EPA methane rules. Their compliance with the new EPA rules is an excuse, or actually exempts them from being subject to the methane emissions charge. It's really complicated the way it's set up in the law, but I'm trying to simplify it for you. Basically, again, one or two things is going to happen. Either the methane emissions charge will be a reality, it'll be implemented, it'll be sort of applied, and nothing else will happen. Or the methane emissions charge will be implemented and applied, and companies will be offered an alternative by complying with a new set of EPA rules. We don't have those rules yet. We tried to, there sort of was an attempt to put them on the books a few administrations ago. They were sort of taken off. They're sort of being debated again. At a minimum, for those of you who are sort of familiar and or government nerds like myself, it takes a good year and a half to put a new EPA rule on the books in terms of proposing the rule, sort of comment period, revisions, etc. After that, there may even be litigation. But to the extent that there will eventually be an alternative to this methane charge in the form of compliance with this new EPA regime, we're probably not going to see that for another year, possibly two, even if they work as fast as possible. So for now, I'll leave you with, and I'll stop here, Dana. This new methane emissions regime is happening. The details are not certain, but the general outlines of it are well defined under the law. And the likelihood that it's going to have different impacts and different sort of demands on state resources is very real. And again, I think the whole reason we organize this webinar, we want to share this information, is that it's something that is not a maybe think about, but a discuss now type of issue. Thank you very much. I'll pause there. I love the questions so far. Happy to take more questions, or Dana, however you want to handle this.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Professor. You've answered a bunch of questions. I'm not sure, and I see some both in the chat and in the Q&A. I'm not sure if this is, I think we've, this one is a little interesting in that I'm not sure we're defining it, but Ted asks, he says, I'm not sure how you define a permanent shut-in well. He, apparently from New York. New York has a 1-year renewable with just cause shut-in approvals. Do you mean inactive or idle wells, or properly plugged in New York State means plugged and abandoned with reclaimed surface?
So I think that's a great question. This is one of those situations where, as I said, I don't have an answer for you under this legislation. There is a practice, there is sort of a precedent of how the EPA thinks of shut-in versus non-shut-in. And there are some definitions in other parts of the law. Generally speaking, it's the idea that it is no longer capable of production, even restoration of production. That's the difference between simply shut in and plugged. But that's the experience in other spaces. There's no guarantee they're going to think of the wells the same way here. I think that the best answer is there's a reason to proactively ask the EPA to adopt, for example, the same regulations you have at the state level, so that they agree with you that your definition of shut-in is the same thing as their definition of shut-in. It's not set one way or other in the law. It's an open question that's best answered with your input rather than on their own, I think, at the end of the day. Not a comfortable answer, but the reality nevertheless.
Seems like good advice. You can see the question that's 2 above that, Mohammed. I think James from West Virginia is commenting that that maybe gives incentives to install equipment that doesn't vent gas.
Oh, there is. I mean, let's talk a little bit about hopefully some of the good news here. If you think about the natural sort of economic consequence here, because the charge is coming, because companies will have to pay, and because there's the negative outcome, there is a very strong incentive for companies to invest in, because this is a big charge. We're talking about $900 to $1,500 a ton, to invest in better capture and better sort of methane emissions management. There's already discussion about a workforce issue, training individuals who can manage that, who can actually install and maintain the systems. There's already discussion about manufacturing capacity to the extent there's more demand for those systems, where will they be sort of built and manufactured. So there are some more positive discussions to be had about, is there a way to think through the whole value chain so that we have both the labor and the equipment and the expertise available in the market for the companies that do choose to actually invest in sort of capture and mitigation. I think it's a very good question. But I think what James is saying, and it's true, the numbers are such that this is going to incentivize or impact a lot of companies. And many of them will choose to spend the money to improve. Some may just pay the penalty, some may just shut in. In any one of those instances, you want to think through in your local sort of marketplace what the impact is going to be on your administrative resources, but also possibly the positive benefit in terms of sort of labor and manufacturing. There's a lot of questions. For example, there's a lot of talk about how there's already a shortage of welders in a lot of markets around the country. And that's going to be a significant potential challenge if we're talking about, field level or systems level upgrades to 2,000 or 3,000 facilities around the country. That's a pretty big demand.
And thank you. And James at West Virginia again comments down below there, Mohamed. I'm sure you see it. Wondering if he's looking at the fine or charges correctly based on compressor engines at a compressor station.
So that's a good question, and I see that question from James. So this is where it's going to be figured out sort of in the weeds afterwards. But remember that only facilities that already are large enough emitters or large enough in terms of their footprint to be required to report under the greenhouse reporting program are subject to this charge for now. And those tend to be fairly large facilities, not sort of portable or flexible scale facilities you may see, or some of sort of the intermittent facilities you see around the country. So I want to be careful. I don't want to oversell this. It's only that list of sort of 2,000 facilities, that sort of group that's already subject to greenhouse reporting, that's immediately going to be the focus of the EPA. And most of those tend to be permanent install facilities with really large operations. And I'm not familiar with the exact type of engine that James is talking about, but as I understand it, these aren't sort of the run-of-the-mill type of questions. And again, remember, there's a budget here. They're allowed to emit up to 25,000 tons of methane. It's only above that threshold that the penalty actually starts to come in. The threshold may change, the strictness of that. And by the way, there's an entire other conversation we had here about the EPA coming up with a way of calculating emissions and monitoring and verifying and reporting. They're doing a lot of work just on the math side of it as well. But I don't want to suggest that this is overly inclusive, but within the set of facilities that are subject to regulation, it could be a very significant impact at the end of the day.
Thank you. And while you were answering that, I think you answered another question or two that was sitting there in the chat area, Ed, also. So you killed a couple birds with one stone there, I believe. Thank you for that. And let's just finish up. We're really at the end of our time here. But Mohamed, would you? I think you addressed this, but could you go back to the last question in the Q&A about preempt state regulations?
Okay. So the direct answer is no. There's no suggestion of preemption here. There's no suggestion that this fee is the only fee that can be charged on methane. And as I said before, in fact, many states at the political level or the policy level have already been talking about an additional layering of a state level methane charge on top of this EPA fee. So no, there's no suggestion that state authority to assess its own methane charge will be sort of preempted, but you also won't be able to be exempted. There's no suggestion that states can opt out of this regime either. So at a minimum, this EPA charge will be a reality. Additional charges at state level are entirely possible, but sort of exempting your state from this regime does not seem to be on the table apart from some special backroom deal under the law itself. Great.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you to our participants for all the great questions and the thought stimulation that you gave us all. We appreciate the support that you all give us, and also Professor Badissy, your participation and willingness to spend time with us and really dig down into something that is so current and affects so many people. Even though I saw as you articulated the list, a little over 2,000, still pretty significant.